Jay losing his memories in Dragon's Rising was debatably one of the best things that ever happened to his character. It led to so many fun scenes, so much interesting character development, and honestly just a generally really good storyline to follow on when it did come to the first 3 seasons. But as of season 4, the Master of Lightning has officially returned, and it seems to be that there aren't going to be any consequences, but I may honestly be wrong. But as of now, it feels like Jay is just essentially back, and it feels like a really fun time for all of the ninja because they're finally united. But the main question is, what if Dragon's Rising never did this plotline? What if Jay basically escaped the merge unharmed? What if the administration never actually found him? This is ultimately a what if scenario. And what ifs are something that I absolutely love to do on this channel, and something that you guys seem to love as well. So I do feel like in honor of season 4, I feel like we should tackle basically one of the biggest questions that could be the case now for Dragon's Rising, and discuss what could have happened with the season and what could have been different if Jay was around basically since the beginning. I do think this is a fairly fun concept, and I definitely want to know what you guys think of it, because I do think there's a lot of interesting stuff here. So let me not waste any more of your time, and let's actually discuss what if Jay never lost his memories. Now, what in this scenario are we actually going to change? Now, the thing we are going to change in particular is, of course, the idea that the administration basically never erased Jay's memories. They never took advantage of him for whatever purpose that they actually have intended. We don't actually know why the administration wanted Jay to begin with. We know that basically it seems to be that Donovan wanted a friend, but that's just kind of it. So let's actually change the rules here. Let's say that Jay still did wake up near the administration, and let's actually say that he still did interact with the administration, but instead of wiping his memories clean and making him into Agent Walker, they essentially imprisoned Jay for basically why not. We know that the administration do it because they do have a detainment cell. So let's hypothesize that Jay was there and he has been stuck since the beginning of the merge. This would mean, in similar vein, Season 1 Part 1 is basically unchanged. There's nothing new to discover when it does come to Season 1 Part 1. However, we will go to Season 1 Part 2, where the ninja do actually find themselves going to the administration, or of course more specifically Lloyd and Aaron. We actually get to see them go through it, and also Zane in an attempt to get one of the Dragon Cores. But in this scenario, we actually do get to see them go towards the detainment center, where they actually do encounter Jay. Lloyd, of course, would have been very excited to finally actually find him, because he is the only ninja by that point that was unaccounted for. So Jay would have been released by Lloyd, and Jay would have helped with basically extracting from the administration. Jay also would have still have had some form of knowledge on the administration. He would have been vaguely aware of how they conduct things, so that probably would have come in importance later, but of course more on that. But the thing is that we would have actually seen Jay help in the escape when it does come to Lloyd and Aaron. And I really do like that, and definitely would have been a cool little addition to have. Jay then gets to reunite with Nia and the rest of the ninja team, and he would have become a part of the ninja team by this point. He wouldn't have had anything additional to do like Cole, for example. So it would have been cool to actually have Jay around, which means he would have taken part in the final battle. I do think in this scenario, Jay essentially would have had happened what happened to Kai as well. I think Jay would have been one of the victims of the merge quakes. In similar vein to what we got to see with Nia when Kai was vanished, I do think we would have seen it again with him. So we would have had Jay basically be absent for some of the finale, but I do think it would have been a bit of a cool thing to see nonetheless. Next up would have been the Elemental Mech short. I think Jay would have had an Elemental Mech with Kai, Cole, and Sora. I think he would have had his own lightning-based one, and I think it would have been really cool to see. I honestly kind of think it would be in similar vein to the mech suit that we see him use in the 3rd season, and I do think that would have been a fun little addition to have. Also would have made for a really cool set. But then moving on to Season 2. Of course, Jay is amongst the rest of the ninja, and we get to see him take part in essentially what is the main plot. And I do think he would have gone along with the rest of the ninja to actually go and learn Rising Dragon technique. I don't think he would have stuck around and been involved in the side plot in similar vein to Zane and Cole. I think he would have been with Nia because basically they do everything together. Jay being along for the main plot also means that we would have seen a depiction on what his fear would have been in the caves. Of course we get to see what Nia's is, which Jay not remembering her and her not being able to find him, but I do think that would have been altered as well because it wouldn't have been a thought in Nia's mind. So we actually have to alter what their fears ultimately are. I do think in this instance we would have seen a callback for Nia's. I think we would have seen her maybe depicted again as a regular civilian, or maybe even a more extreme version of it. Maybe her being a civilian and also never getting her powers back. Maybe call it back to when she lost her abilities, and maybe it's something that she still thinks about to this current day. But it does lead to a more important question of what would Jay's biggest fear actually be? It would maybe be something in similar vein to Nia, say if she was lost like how he was. Maybe it would have been losing her. But I do think his fear as a whole is just generally speaking being alone. Jay by definition is a social creature. He interacts with anyone and anything. He loves his family, he loves his friends, and he just loves life in of itself. So I do think we would have seen a depiction on what Jay's fear was, which was ultimately having no one. But past this point in time, we would have seen him then taking part in attempting to learn Rising Dragon technique. And I think ultimately speaking, he would have been in similar vein to Lloyd and Nia. I think he would have discovered it after the point of Kai, and probably more towards the end of Season 2 Part 1 in of itself. It would have been basically he's just kind of along for the ride, which is a bit of a shame, but also just would have really have made sense. And ultimately speaking, not bad whatsoever. But the thing is that he doesn't really change anything in accordance with Season 2 Part 1. The only involvement he has in the canonical timeline is him actually attempting to arrest Bonzel, but Bonzel ultimately convinces him to not do it, so it's not exactly like anything would have changed in that regard. So, at the end of the day, we would have just had a scenario where Jay would have been along for the main plot, and that would have been basically it. Following this is Season 2 Part 2, where in the canonical timeline he is of course more prevalent by this point, but the main difference being is that he wasn't manipulated by Raz and ultimately never shattered his goodness. In this what if scenario, instead of Jay having that role, we would have seen him go to the tournament like the rest of the ninja of course, and we would have seen him take part. But the thing is that I do think him versus Nia wasn't exactly rigged by any account, and it just seems to be naturally how the brackets unfolded. So we have to assume that Jay would have still have fought Nia, and I think this is where the ultimate difference would have been. In this scenario, I think Jay would have willingly have forfeited his powers so Nia could move on to the following rounds. This means we wouldn't have had any interesting interactions between the two. We wouldn't have seen him, like I said, shatter his goodness. We wouldn't have seen him depicting himself as hating her. We wouldn't have seen him leave the tournament. We would have just simply have seen him lose. And that feels a little bit boring, but ultimately that is just what would have happened. There's no other way of putting it. But I think Jay ultimately would have knocked himself out in favor of Nia. I don't think Jay could have comprehended the idea of taking on Nia within a battle. I don't think she would have liked it, but I definitely think that's would have been his decision ultimately. But this does lead to a few knock-on effects, such as Nia not leaving throughout half of the season. This means Nia would have stuck around to help in the training of the people still within the tournament. We would have seen her actually take part more directly, and we also would have seen Jay interacting with others. I honestly reckon that we would have seen scenes of Jay teaching Nia how to use lightning. I think we could have seen some really cool scenes of her depicting how she feels closer to him because she's using his elements. We would have seen them actually have some really cute moments, honestly, and it definitely would have done a lot for the shippers. But because canonically speaking, that is it for Jay in terms of what happens in the season, it means that the what if scenario is also kind of not too much. Jay doesn't have an impact beyond. Like I said, Nia just would have been around, so we wouldn't have actually have seen Nia just randomly appear towards the end of the season. This means Jay would have tried to help at the end, taken on Noct. This means Jay would have gotten his powers back. It basically just means the exact same scenario, which is kind of boring, but ultimately Jay was more important when it did come to the third season. So let's actually get into that instead. A fair few things change in Season 3, ultimately because Jay is not Rogue. Rogue does have an impact on the story when it does come to it, but I do think there are ways essentially around it. Of course, again, in the canonical timeline, we would have seen Rogue essentially taking on bounties, and more specifically taking on a bounty to secure Raz. And I do think that is fairly interesting to actually note. He is basically after Raz for a majority of the season and does impact Raz's plans, as Raz states himself. himself. The other big thing is that Kai and Nia are separated for a part of the story because they are trying to search for Jay, so we have to account for them as well. So in this what if, of course Jay, Nia, Kai and Wildfire are all accompanying Lloyd, Frack, Sora and Ryu within the main plot of the story. It means there would have been a lot more ninja to account for the prismatic blades. But ultimately, and unfortunately, I don't think it honestly would have made a lot of a difference. So we would have actually have seen them when they actually split up into groups, but bigger groups of that. Again, canonically speaking, Lloyd, Sora, Frack and Ryu went off on their own, and Zane was by himself, which ultimately led him to Pixel. But in this scenario, I believe that accompanying Zane would have been Kai, Nia and Wildfire, and I believe Jay would have went with Lloyd. This would have allowed Kai and Nia and Wildfire to have some interactions with Noct, ultimately still losing the prismatic blade, and Zane would have still have had to have stopped the train because it's technically his season, but we would have seen some fun interactions. Kai remarking at a rematch, Nia remarking at basically the involvement of the Forbidden Five, Wildfire just being Wildfire, but it would have been a really cool scene to have actually seen, and definitely would have made the numbers a little more even. We also then, like I said, would have seen Jay with the other ninja, and it would have been cool to have seen him react to the situations accordingly. We would have seen him take on the big Dorama puppet, and even Zark for that matter. It would have been, again, some really cool depictions. It would have been really interesting to have seen, for example, Jay trying to use lightning on the Dorama puppet, ultimately for it to mean nothing. There were tons of really cool little bits that we could have seen, definitely with Jay accompanying them. But the biggest lingering plot point is the fact that with the absence of Rogue, we wouldn't have actually gotten to see Zeatrix hire Rogue to actually capture Raz. So we're missing a bounty hunter when it does come to this season, and I think they would have taken this opportunity to introduce an older bounty hunter and reintroduce into Ninjago because he was kind of good at it, to say the least, and that is, of course, Ronin. I really do think that in this scenario it would have been the perfect time to actually reintroduce the bounty hunter of Ronin. I think it would have been a cool way to actually have him transition into this era of Ninjago, and it would have been a cool opportunity to show off what he's been up to. I think it would have come with the return of the Ronin Rex, but he basically for the most part would have had the role of Rogue. I think it does make sense for some other reasons we will specify in a moment. But we would have seen the ninja interact with him, they would have been more aware of the fact that it was him because Ronin's never hidden his identity, and we would have seen just some cool moments between the lot, them remarking that him used to being their friend, him saying that he's foiled too many schemes for them to be friends anymore. It would have been honestly a really fun little back and forth, but it does fill the role of a character that is now missing. This means that for the most part, Season 3 Part 1 basically plays out the same, and you may be wondering, why does the season have to play out the same? Well, that's because we still need the release of Thunderfang, and it makes sense for it to be Ronin, because one thing that the ninja needed in accordance with Rogue was those jetpacks that we do see towards the end of the season, and we've actually seen Ronin use something very similar before. In the 6th season, Ronin used a similar flight pack to capture Kai and Nia, so the ninja would have still been able to get the technology they needed to actually take on the Forbidden Five within the end. So the season basically plays out in the same vein, but Jay helping out the rest of the ninja. But there is one major difference that we now need to address, and that is the fact that with Jay not actually being part of the administration, the end of Season 3 Part 1 theoretically couldn't actually happen. The end of Season 3 Part 1 shows Jay telling the ninja that Aaron's parents are actually still alive, and he knew exactly where they were, confirming the fact that Raz was lying to Aaron about the state of his parents, and that is ultimately one of the biggest hooks and the biggest setups when it does come to Part 2. So we need to account for the fact that the ninja still basically need to learn this information, and that is where we're going to encounter an issue. Because there's no natural way now for the administration to be introduced back into the plot. So we need to figure out a way for the ninja basically to go to the administration and ultimately learn of the fate of Aaron's parents. But I do think there is a way to get around this. So instead of Season 3 Part 1 ending how it did, the season actually just ends with the Thunderfang hook. We will then go into Season 3 Part 2, where we see the ninja essentially discussing what happened when it comes to Aaron. We will see Sora catching up the ninja in accordance with the fact that his parents were presumably gone, and we will see them basically discussing about how to move going forward when it did come to Aaron. But the thing is that the conversation turns to the fact that they were starting to question whether or not the answers of Raz actually did make sense. events. They'll talk about how Frak was manipulated by Raz as well, and they will discuss the possibility that maybe Raz is lying to Eren for his own purposes. And this is where Jay will actually bring up the administration. Like I said, in the first season, because he was detained for so long within the administration, he did start to learn some of their secrets. So we will see Jay discuss the fact that the administration does keep tabs on a lot of people. They do actually keep track of things that may not be explained, and they will talk about the fact that they know that Eren's neighborhood was actually displaced, and Jay will remark at the fact that is something the administration actually handles. So they devise a plan to sneak into the administration like we do see with season 3 part 2, but instead of going in with suits and going in with all of these little tricks up their sleeve, we will see them actually have to stealth their way in an attempt to learn the answers. And they will learn answers, mainly in the introduction again of the Land of Lee, but the difference is that they will not sneak in as residents. We will actually see the ninja learn about the Land of Lee and have to travel there naturally, and sneak in like how we kind of get to see later on during season 3 part 2, but we'll actually get to see a new team of ninja go in and just attempt to figure out the way of the land. I think Jay would have been a part of this group, still along with Nia and Lloyd, and probably not Wildfire, but also potentially still her, but regardless I will run at the fact that it is the same team. But we'll see them sneak in, and we'll actually get to see a multi-story arc where we actually get to see them learn about the Land of Lee basically through observation. They won't directly interact with Lee, we'll get to see the antics, but just not in the direct sense. This will also mean that the reveal of the fact that Lee is evil would play out very differently. Instead of seeing implication and the ninja finding out naturally and also with the intervention of Lee, we would have seen them essentially get caught during their stealth-like missions. One of the biggest things that they would have been doing during this arc is scoping the land, keeping track of civilians, watching how Lee basically does his patterns. It would have been really interesting to see it from this bird's-like view, but the ninja ultimately would have been trying to find the right people basically in a crowd of strangers. Remember, they didn't actually know what Eren's parents looked like, so they would have had to have taken some risks, and that is what would have happened. They would have taken too much of a risk and Lee would have caught them, hence then the reveal that he is actually evil, because then we would have seen the Lees actually form an attack like we do get to see within the season itself. In similar vein to the canonical timeline though, this all would have ultimately been interrupted by the Hollow Ones coming through. We would have seen still the invasion because that was just kind of what was happening at the time, and they were picking on dense pockets of people. So the ninja still would have been interrupted, and this whole scenario ultimately would have played out the same. So whilst the Land of Lee on an overall does still have a relatively similar timeline, it would have just involved more of a stealth-like ninja approach instead of the in-disguise civilian approach. It just would have emphasized the fact that they're ninja, and I do think it would have been a cool alternative way to look at it. Things then again would have been playing out relatively the same, and it would have gotten to the point where in the canonical timeline, Jay actually does depart from the rest. This is where Nia then goes to Mysterium and tries to play things out on her own until Kai turns up. In the what if scenario, Jay would have still have accompanied Nia, and he just wouldn't have left. We would have just seen him there the whole time instead of turning up at the end to fight against Zarkt. I do think Jay probably would have still have taken that big dragon mech, because I think Jay just kind of likes those big cool shiny vehicles, but I do think that Jay just would have been there the whole time. This ultimately would have had the finale again play out relatively the same, and ultimately have them all still stranded in the realm of madness once more when Raz locks them off at the end of the season. Which brings us ultimately to season 4, and instead of Jay, Nia and Kai trying to go into the administration to get Jay's memories, we would have seen them just trying to escape the Land of Madness like they did once before. They wouldn't have been able to leave on a vehicle from Rapton's crew because Jay isn't friends with Rapton in this timeline. We would have seen them essentially just try to escape in a different sense. They may have still have gone to the administration because they would have known it to be the closest structure in accordance with them. We would have seen them maybe go back there to try and commandeer a vehicle, or just try and use it in some sort of means to escape. But they wouldn't have lingered in the realm of madness like we actually got to see in season 4 part 1, because there's no memories to go and take. This means they would have been involved in the main plot a lot further along, and they may have actually gotten to Imperium at the same time or even before Cole. So I do think it would have, again, basically played out the same, because this is where Jay does ultimately get his memories back. But this is where we're caught up. There's not really much else to talk about because Jay now has his memories and things just would have continued to go on as they did. So in this what if scenario, we would have definitely seen a change in events and the introduction of a different character, but ultimately I do think Dragon's Rising as a plot overall does play out the same. The thing is that in this scenario, Jay does retain some knowledge that he did learn basically during his time in the administration, just not as potent of knowledge, and also we would have just seen him basically have just taken part in the season regularly because he just doesn't have a lot of seasons where he is involved in. But I do think things would have changed regardless. I do think we would have still seen some interesting differences, and I for one definitely would have liked to have seen that because I do think it's fairly interesting. I do think Jay could have had a fun part in the earlier seasons where he's not there, but unfortunately, or more specifically fortunately if you really like Rogue, he ultimately did have a different path. But that is my what if on if Jay never lost his memories, and I would like to know, what do you think of this different scenario? Would you have liked to have seen a stealth mission in the land of Lee? Would you have liked to have seen the return of Ronin? Would you have liked to have seen Jay sacrifice himself and teach Nia how to use lightning in the Tournament of Sources? I would love to know your thoughts on it because I do find it fairly interesting, and I just would like to know if you guys like these outcomes, and also what other what ifs you would like to see in the future. I love doing these, and I hope you like them just as much as me. But thank you very much for watching the video, and I do hope you enjoyed, and if you did, please consider subscribing. I honestly love just talking about Ninjago with more people, and if you do want to support the channel any further, which you do not have to, you could always become a channel member and join the legends that you do see on screen. Each of you, your support means the absolute world to me, and I cannot thank you enough. But like I said, that is about it for today, and take care. Okay,